Difficulty in games has historically been one of the main characteristics that define a game. Take Space Invaders as an example. As the player progresses, not only does their score go up, so does the difficulty. The invaders speed up, yet the interesting thing is that this was actually a bug that turned into a feature. It was probably the first time that we saw a proper difficulty curve in a video game. So today I want to share my thoughts and opinions on difficulty in games and how to do it right. There are two types of difficulty in games, and one of them is artificial difficulty. To me, this difficulty is essentially the one that we see in most games. It is affected by whatever difficulty setting the specific game has pre-designed. For example, in Resident Evil, if you play one of the easiest difficulties, a zombie can probably be defeated with 3 shots, or even 1 shot if you're lucky. On the contrary, if the player now goes through the game in the hardest difficulties, a zombie now might take around 5 bullets to be defeated, even if you hit him in the head. Same thing happens with their speed in easier difficulties. You can just probably dodge them all the time, or you can take your time to shoot at them keeping your distance. However, when you play in harder difficulties, they lunge at you, and are able to close distance very quickly if you're not careful. Now I'm not saying that this is bad, because it still can be fun. It can be beneficial for replayability, and for players who are seeking a challenge. However, I think that there are better ways to let the player know about difficulty that might make more sense and allow for a better experience for the player. I am also not going to be talking here about difficulty in games like Dark Souls or Nioh, because in those games, difficulty is more about punishing the player for their mistakes, rather than the game actually being hard. In those games, you as the player can choose to make it as easy or hard as you want, depending on your level, equipment, etc. What I call real difficulty is when the developers actually think more about how to provide a challenge for the player. They use elements like the environment or the enemy placement while considering the abilities that the player has at their disposal. With the recent release of Mario All-Stars on the Nintendo Switch, I played Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels for the first time. The first thing I noticed from that game is that the difficulty is done by enemy placement and by changing the environment. Let me explain in more detail. What I like about this game is that it is a challenge for the people who already played the original game, but they do really clever things that as a designer really stood out to me. Typically, developers tend to change things like the way enemies work, but Nintendo did the opposite. For example, one thing that the developers could have done to increase difficulty is enable the Goombas to deal double damage, make them faster or make them stronger, so that Mario has to hit them twice in order for them to die. They also don't overpopulate the levels with a ton of enemies, or overuse a certain type of obstacle or enemy. On the contrary, Nintendo, being smart and one of the best devs in the world, decided to do something different and in my opinion very unique. They took the level design and changed how they place their enemies in the level. It is pretty genius for them to not only understand the enemy types the game has, but also use these in combination with the layout to their advantage. They place the enemies in places that are a challenge for the player to purposely increase the difficulty. They also take into consideration the abilities of Mario, like how far he can jump, the speed at which he can run, and the power-ups that he can get. This approach is great because it makes the difficulty feel cohesive as you play the game. It makes sense for the player from start to finish because a Goomba in level 1 is as powerful as a Goomba in level 8. What I like about this approach is that, for example, in one level, instead of using Goombas, they place a blooper. This is because the blooper has a more erratic movement, and is thus more difficult to deal with than the Goombas. They also use environmental obstacles to trick the player. One of my favorite things about that game is how it repeats levels, making them harder. I think this is great, because it shows us all that it is not about how many enemies you can place in a game, or how much damage they deal. It's about the developer's ability to understand the game at its core, the mechanics, and how the player might interact with the game when they are playing. One example is World 7-4 versus C4. It is essentially the same level all around. However, there are a couple of subtle changes that make C4 more challenging. When we get past the bossy beetles, we see a fire bar. Now in level 7-4, there is no blocking here, while in level C4, there is a block. What this does is making the player have to go and stand right in the corner in order to not receive any damage. The next part is similar, but now there are 2 blocks in the place where Mario will be safe, so in order to beat the obstacle, the player has to do a quick maneuver based on the position of the firebar. Another example is level 8-4 and D4. These levels are almost the same, but there are some key differences that make D4 a little harder. The first thing to note is the huge firebar in level D4, which is much shorter on level 8-4. Then, as we progress to the level, we see that the platforming challenge gets more complicated as well. After that, the areas change completely. but what we have to realize here is that on 8.4 there are only 3 bloopers and 3 firebars, while in the other there is 1 hammer bros, 2 paratroopers, and 2 bloopers with wind added. They make the area feel more difficult playing with enemy types, placement, and layout. To make things worse, the final jump to the pipe in World D4 has to be precise, in order to not get killed by the piranha plant coming out from it. This all makes sense, since D4 is the final level of the game, and the player should be skilled enough to get through it. However, you have to be careful to not do things that will make the player feel unlucky or unfair, like putting invisible blocks right where you're about to jump a cliff, or having platforms disappear when you're about to land on them. Difficulty is tricky to get right. There is a lot of playtesting needed, and even then, a game might feel too punishing or too easy. The Lost Levels initially had been released as Mario 2, but never made it to the US because it was deemed too difficult for the general public. That is why you always have to take into consideration your enemy types, layout, and player abilities in conjunction to decide what challenges to throw at the player. Make sure that all of these challenges are always fair and make the player engage with the game, as opposed to frustrated and angry about your game being totally unfair. And that's it, you guys. Thank you so much for watching. What kind of difficulty design do you prefer in games? Please let me know in the comment section below. Also, if you like this video, please subscribe and share it with your friends. See you next time!